Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everyone. Kathy and Sheila here. Sheila?
Hey there, everybody.
We're excited. There you are. We're excited to bring you this IFN Academy live Q&A with Dr. John Bagnulo, faculty presenter for Track 1, Module 3, Food as Medicine, Healing Foods and Dietary Therapies. Just want to give you a few quick details for this live Q&A. We have 1 hour with Dr. Bagnulo. This is being recorded for your future listening, and you will receive a replay link. And we do have you muted to avoid background noise, so we're going to ask you to go ahead and start typing your questions in the chat box that you see there. And folks, the questions, I just want to mention, are in no particular order. Dr. Bagnulo, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Kathy, and thanks, Sheila. It's great to be with you today.
Wonderful.
Yeah, we're so glad to have you here with us. And so we're going to get started, and I'm going to read the first question, and Sheila and I will go back and forth. But the first question, Dr. Bagnulo, is, does A2 milk have the same renal acid load as A1 milk?
Yes, it does. It only differs in one amino acid, and that's not going to be significant in any way, shape, or form with respect to that PRAL value.
And Dr. Bagnulo, PRAL, you're referring to PRAL, potential renal acid load.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Sorry.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. All right, Kathy. So you want me to read the next question?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So as Kathy said, we're not taking the questions in any particular order. All right. So here's a question for you, John. I enjoy the Health Edge podcast tremendously. Thanks for sharing the knowledge. Would you consider writing a lifestyle and recipe book?
Maybe at some point. I have 5 small children, and life's pretty busy right now.
Okay.
And some aspects of my lifestyle, particularly sleep,
Right.
are where I'd really like them to be. But yeah, it would be fun. It would be fun at some point to share with folks our favorite family recipes and a little bit about how we try to structure a day for both our health and our kids' health. I certainly would love to do it if I had a little more time.
Sure. Let me go ahead and actually move to another question for you here then. How important is it, since we're talking about the A2, how important is it for a person to consume A2 dairy in an area where goat's milk, A2 milk, raw milk, sheep's milk, etc., are not easily accessible? What would you recommend for the general population?
Yeah, in that situation, if A2 milk is not available, then I think you would probably do best limiting your dairy consumption to those dairy products which are either A, fermented extensively, i.e. yogurt, kefir, and or maybe choose the really high fat, low protein dairy products such as, sour cream, for instance, obviously butter. I think A2 milk it's the gold standard. And I think when it's not available, then the other relatively healthy dairy choices that will contribute to a person's health would be, yogurt containing live cultures, or the fat that's found in grass-fed dairy products. But, with everything I know now about the difference between A1 and A2 milk, I can't really in any way justify the consumption of A1 milk. So yeah, I think you're going to really want to limit the scope of the dairy products you consider if A2 milk is not available.
Gotcha. Okay. All right, Kathy, want to read the next question?
Sure. Lots of questions, Dr. Bagnulo, about soy. Soy, especially with regard to someone's asking about soy and thyroid. Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, sure. I will share a couple papers from 2015 and 2016. One's in the Journal of Endocrinology and Metabolism, and I think the other was in a public health journal that showed double-blinded studies, what 30 grams of soy protein does to thyroid stimulating hormone TSH levels in women in particular. They change rapidly. Again, much more so in women than in men. The other study also showed changes in thyroid hormone levels, and really this is because soy is a fairly potent goitrogen. Goitrogens, for those of our listeners that might not be familiar with that term, they're basically a class of anti-nutrients.
Mm-hmm.
Most of your brassicas and soybeans, millet. There's a long list of plants that contain glucosinolates, and these glucosinolates are metabolized in the intestine to a isocyanate and glucose, so they're broken down. And the isocyanate, once it's absorbed into the bloodstream, it will compete. It will compete with iodine for uptake by the thyroid gland, so it can radically reduce the production of thyroid hormones, even in the presence of normal, or I should say adequate dietary iodine. It gets much worse if iodine levels in the diet are low or suboptimal. So, it's just a fact that goitrogens interfere with thyroid metabolism, and there are certain populations that are much more susceptible to that action than others. Women appear to be far more susceptible to men, but that's not to say that men are not without risk of consuming goitrogens regularly. So, and I really like to talk about soy under a broader category of what I refer to as biological compatibility. That's not a term I see anywhere else really out there in the field of nutrition and metabolism. But to me, it's a core component to my philosophy and how I work with people. If a food is not biologically compatible, and in most foods you're going to have, at least some area where there might be an issue. But soy, right from the beginning, whether you're talking about the goitrogenic activity, the trypsin inhibitors, the list goes on with soy. It's just right. So, I just don't really recommend soy consumption for people on a regular basis. I think if someone wanted to eat soy, I think you'd want to have a heavily processed and or fermented soy product.
Sure.
Right. The fermentation process helps a little bit. I'm not sure how much it's going to help with the goitrogenic activity. There's some really interesting research on that showing that some fermented foods that are, to start with, very goitrogenic, like cabbage, for instance. The goitrogens in cabbage actually get worse after fermentation, which is really surprising to people. But with soy, I'm more in favor of fermented soy because the fermentation would break down some of the proteins in soy that can be, more of an allergen, or people have soy intolerances at the digestive front. So I think that's the way to go. But I don't really recommend soy for people. And what I'm often presented with, and I think it's really an indictment, in my opinion, of where we are right now as a medical system and how we look at foods. What I'm always presented with, and I'm sure, that Sheila, you and Kathy are as well, is, people will send me papers that show soy consumption lowers cholesterol levels. And it's as though that's the piece of information that's going to change the message. It's just not the case. First of all, if lowering our cholesterol levels, if that is how we are going to judge a food's level of fit, let's say, for human consumption, we're really looking down the wrong street. A lot of things will lower your cholesterol levels, and they're, I think, terrible for human physiology. And I really bring into question the whole notion of why is it we want to use cholesterol levels as a litmus test for health anyways. But that being said, I just don't think soy is compatible. I think it can be tolerated in moderation, but I think it has several different anti-nutrient-like effects in place. So I don't recommend it, and I think that thyroid health is the one area, and maybe digestive health is a close second, but I feel digestive health is more on an individual basis as to whether or not someone tolerates it or not. But I don't look at soy consumption as necessarily being an increased risk for cancer or heart disease or anything like that. I look at soy consumption as, just really presenting the thyroid gland with a difficult hurdle if it's consumed regularly. It's probably not great for many of our digestive linings or fronts. And so with that, I think, for me, that's enough to say soy is not a really good fit.
Gotcha. Okay. Excellent. Thank you. All right. I'm going to go ahead and read the next question then. Here we go. Dr. Bagnulo, you mentioned years ago at a conference that it was better if you are going to eat an egg to eat it sunny side up and not flip it over so as to have the yolk become in contact with the pan. Can you please comment on this?
Yeah, sure. So I think an egg is as close to a superfood as, if I'm going to call anything a superfood, I've only got a limited number of choices there in terms of the nourishment they offer. So I'm a big fan of egg consumption. I try to eat 3 eggs every day, but I think it's really important that the egg yolk be kept away from the highest heat applications in cooking. I think it's really good to keep the egg yolk more gelatinous. Even to the runny, I know that that's really controversial with respect to food safety and people being concerned with the pathogens that could potentially be carried in egg. But the less an egg yolk is cooked, the better. And if you cook one sunny side up, then the one side of that egg yolk is going to be in closer contact with the pan, higher heat, and that's where you oxidize the cholesterol in an egg yolk. And that's really, oxidation is the enemy here, because cholesterol consumed in an unoxidized state, it's not atherogenic. It's going to, it's going to be metabolized, and, your body, if it can be sulfated, that's even better. It's going to really it's going to be used by the body. I mean, cholesterol is so critical to the human body. And the more we learn about cholesterol every week, the more we appreciate it. And I think it's going to, at some point in time, much like what's happened to saturated fat, it will be vindicated. Not just dietary cholesterol, but even serum cholesterol will be looked at under a different lens. I mean, we know now that lower cholesterol levels are just not good for all-cause mortality as people, hit age 60. There's a few really good papers out there now. And pardon my, I'm digressing here, but let me go back to dietary cholesterol and say that, when it's oxidized, it becomes very atherogenic. That's the type of cholesterol that, we really don't have a lot of room for margin of error before it starts to cause problems. And I just think that keeping eggs cooked less, soft-boiled eggs, sunny side up, great. You flip that egg over from sunny side up, now you browned the egg on both sides. Now you've got a much larger percentage of that cholesterol within the egg yolk that is oxidized and has formed what we call an oxysterol. And oxysterols are found in powdered eggs, heavily scrambled or fried eggs. They're found in powdered milk products where the small amount of cholesterol in a dairy product is spray dried and it's reacting with oxygen. So there's a lot of other ways that you can consume oxysterols, but powdered eggs are the #1 source in the human diet. And I don't think anybody should eat powdered eggs. And then after powdered eggs or instant eggs, you have heavily cooked egg yolks. So it's always good to keep eggs a little less. The whites can be really thoroughly cooked, but it's the yolk that you want to keep a little less cooked. They don't have to be raw, but ideally you want to keep them more in a gelatinous state as opposed to becoming all dry and crumbly or browned or even worse, burned.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you. Thank you so much. Kathy is having a couple of technical difficulties at the moment, so I'm going to go ahead and read the next question here. Okay, so actually I wanted to go back to the milk question. Based on the fact that A2 milk also has the same renal acid load, which has negative health impacts, Okay. Would you say it's still good for kids and adults alike to consume 2 to 3 cups of A2 milk daily?
Yeah, let me start off by saying that the potential renal acid load of milk is pretty close to neutral. It's not a significant acid load, and it's if that were the case, then it would be pretty tough for developing children or animals, in the case of a calf, to build the bone density that they need. It's only when you eliminate the whey product from a dairy food, i.e. hard cheeses, that you start to see that potential renal acid load.
Right.
Start to see that really climb. So I don't look at milk as being, that was, if you went back 20 years and you heard what was being said by the, experts on more plant-based vegetarian diets, that was the argument that was being made, is that that milk, or that they used the word dairy product. They use that phrase, dairy products. And then if you say that, well, yeah, hard cheeses are an acid load, but milk and yogurt are not significant acid loads. They have very, very mild, if any, acid load. I mean, I've seen some analysis, USDA data, where milk is a 0, which means it has no effect on that potential renal acid load. So first of all, I'd want to start there. The second thing is, I think it's important to look at A2 milk just a little more closely. That's definitely a good starting point, but I don't know as though I would recommend anybody have 2 to 3 glasses of pasteurized, homogenized A2 milk. I'm a big fan of raw A2 milk, and I think that's good for most people, probably not everybody, definitely good for children, as long as, children do not have any kind of, issues with the dairy proteins per se. But, by and large, most people don't. It's the most compatible form of milk out there. An A2 milk that's not pasteurized, not homogenized. It's going to be easier for people to digest the lactose. It's going to be just, easier to digest overall, because so many of the enzymes are inherent to that milk. So I would say that that's a really good thing for people to have daily, by and large. But I don't know as though I would recommend someone consume 2 to 3 glasses of pasteurized, homogenized A2 milk. I don't feel strongly about that, and I would actually probably question it unless I knew a little bit more about the milk.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. Well, let's see. We do have one more question about the A2 milk. Let me go ahead and, since we're on that subject, you may have kind of already answered this, John, but do you recommend A2 milk over 100% grass-fed organic milk?
Well, I would hope that they would not be mutually exclusive. I would hope that someone could find an A2 milk that was also grass-fed. Look, the organic is an important thing to me, but if a milk is 100% grass-fed, I don't really have the concerns with the organic certification. And I know that, maybe someone for an organic certification governing board would say, well, wait a minute, they could still give those cows growth hormone. Yeah, if you have a cow that's entirely grass-fed, growth hormones aren't going to come into the picture. 99.9% of the time, growth hormones are given to cows that are on grain, and it is in an industrial, farm factory type operation where they're just trying to get every drop of milk out of these cows that they can. And that's not going to happen with a grass-fed operation. So I look at grass-fed as being very important. And I would not, let me back up. I would not want someone to drink A2 milk that was grain-fed. So but I would hope that, for our listeners, they could find a grass-fed milk that was, also A2. If not, again, I think things have to be aligned for milk consumption to be warranted. Let's put it that way. And if it's grass-fed A2 milk and it's raw, then that also, like I talked about with eggs, that's an incredibly nourishing food that so many people are missing out on. When you look at the nutrients that people are really missing out on, sulfated vitamin D, the only way you're going to get that is with raw milk. You look at the minerals, the potassium content of milk and yogurt is phenomenal. So there's just so many good things about high quality milk and yogurt products. That being said, when you look at the research on dairy consumption and let's just say prostate cancer in men or breast cancer in women, there's some serious question marks that can be asked about whether or not dairy is good for a population based on some of these kind of big population studies. But, that milk is all A1 milk, and it's all grain-fed milk. So that's, it's an indictment of that kind of dairy product. But I think that's where dairy has really been called into question. And I would go along with questioning the compatibility of those types of dairy products. But and that's why I really don't think it's wise to consume A1 milk or grain-fed milk. There's just a lot of things that could come with that dairy product that would not be healthy for a human. But it's the exact opposite when it's a grass-fed A2 milk and it's raw. Then I think it's at the opposite end of the spectrum. It becomes something that's not only compatible, but it's incredibly nourishing.
Excellent. Well, actually, what you've just said helped answer a few of the other questions that came in, so that's awesome. I think Kathy is on now. Kathy, you want to read the next question?
Yeah, and sorry, it's a heavy storm here, so I've been in and out. But yeah, the next one was, we encourage eating in season. And someone's wondering, how does frozen produce fit into this model?
Yeah, well, I mean, frozen food is, I think, a really good product overall. I mean, it's going to be probably 99% of what fresh, raw, unfrozen is. I think that the part of the question that's interesting, and I think we need more research to, I always try to separate what I have empirical evidence around and what I have suspicions or strong feelings around. So I'll just share some of those with you. After I'd say, right, at this point in time, I have no empirical scientific evidence that eating out of season presents a human with unique challenges that, that may compromise their health. Okay, so I don't have any evidence of that. But let's just take into consideration a few aspects of human physiology that are closely related to eating in season. When is it over the course of human history, when is it, let's say, at a moderate latitude, let's say, I live here in New England, over the course of human history, at this latitude, when is it that people would eat nuts and seeds? The answer is that they'd eat nuts and seeds in the autumn, right? September, October. The fat that comes in nuts and seeds is predominantly what? It's polyunsaturated fat. When do you want polyunsaturated fat in your skin, in your cell membranes? You want it in the cold temperatures that are coming right after autumn. Okay, and I think everybody can follow along with this. When is it you would want saturated fat as a more integral part of your cell membranes and your physiology overall? You'd want that saturated fat to be the predominant type of fat in your skin when the sun is most intense, which would be late spring, summer. And you know what? When you think about the foods that meat in particular, which is most abundant, grass-fed meat in particular, very rich in saturated fat, that's when it's going to happen. It's so really where I'm going with this is, if we just look at fat, and we can take this even further. We can look at the type of sugar that our ancestors would have consumed. You're going to consume more fructose in the summer when fruit is available. And that's the best time to eat fructose, is when you have higher levels of vitamin D. That really is really protective against the damage of fructose at a cellular level. So, for me, it just makes too much sense. It just, we want to eat in season. That's really important, to eat in season, because biochemically things are much more aligned. And I think that the research in this area should come. I think it's a matter of time. We're really aware of how fast cell turnover is, and that phospholipid bilayer, what the phospholipid bilayer looks like with exposure to varying levels of food over time, and fatty acids in particular. I mean, fatty acids, the changeover within a cell is really evident in just 2 or 3 weeks. You take a person's cell, you analyze it, you give them different levels of fat in their diet, and then you analyze it again in 25 to 30 days, and you can see the change. So where I'm going with this is, I think it makes sense for a polar bear to eat almost entirely polyunsaturated fat living in the Arctic. I think it would be devastating to a polar bear's health if they were to eat coconut oil in that environment. For everything we know about the way polyunsaturated fats influence the phospholipid bilayer, thermogenesis, PPAR receptors, you name it. So it makes sense to eat in season. That being said, I don't know as though I'd want someone to try to eat in season and have a dramatically limited choice of food. So I think it's important to eat vegetables, to eat maybe modest amounts of fruit, even if some of those choices are out of season, in an effort to provide the array of nutrients that are really needed. So I don't want this to be confusing to people. I'm trying to, I guess, give people both sides of the argument here. I think it's important to eat in season as much as you can, but I would want someone to have less rigidity and be able to be a little more flexible with food choices if it meant that they were going to at least get all the nutrients they need for the day or the week. Does that make sense?
Yes, sorry about that. I was muted. Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's really fascinating, isn't it? I'm looking as you're speaking.
Yeah, and Sheila, let me just add to that. I just put this out there. I know for people that can want to take this next step. So, I really eat the most salmon and really the most polyunsaturated fat. I start eating those in August and September. Look, that's when salmon run. That's when our ancestors would have eaten the most omega-3 rich foods, is in the late summer and fall. Just another example of this. And I really don't eat a lot of omega-3 rich foods or a lot of polyunsaturated fats in the spring, late winter and spring. That's when I start to really shift over to eating. That's when I start shifting over to eating more butter and coconut oil and things like that, which are going to be integrated into the phospholipid bilayer and give our skin protection, against the more intense ultraviolet rays that come with summer. So I just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. So, all right. So the next, we have a lot of questions here, John, and I'm trying to see if we have any more questions related on that subject, but there's so many. I'm going to go ahead and skip over to this one. Do you recommend use of iodized salt? Do you recommend trace mineral supplementation? And if so, are there products you feel comfortable recommending?
Yeah, I probably would refrain from using brand names. I don't know. I try to stay as unbiased as I can. I think there are some good choices out there with salt that has iodine added to it. You can look on the shelves of a natural food store or your local co-op or food cooperative, and you can find iodized sea salt. It's actually out there now. I think iodine is a really important nutrient for so many people. I think a lot of people really miss out on iodine. It's unfortunate. I would rather someone use iodized salt as long as it didn't have aluminum silicate in it. There's a lot of aluminum added to salts to keep them, less. They won't form clumps, and it's an anti-aggregate. Is really how it's added, but it's unfortunate. There's no reason for us to intentionally consume aluminum. So I think iodized salt is good for those who might not eat any sea vegetables, might not use, an iodine supplement. When it comes to trace minerals, I don't really use or recommend trace mineral supplements. I try to recommend more foods that are really foundational for mineral and trace mineral needs. I mean, liver, I really recommend for those that can find liver and that can develop the recipes that work for them and their family. I recommend liver once a week. It's just such an incredible source of trace minerals. The same, we talked about raw milk. That's another amazing source of trace minerals and as well as macro minerals. So I really try to stick with foods first. But I do think there are certainly cases where people need that extra support. And then that's when I would recommend a supplement that had an array of trace minerals. But you got to be careful because there are some out there that, might have too much copper. I think that based on a person's diet, something like copper or manganese, it can become an issue pretty quickly if the levels are high because of the added supplement.
Perfect. Thank you. Kath.
Okay. There's a lot of different guidelines regarding vitamin D levels. Could you give us your opinion on what you think, number one, what you should measure and what an optimal level is?
Yeah, sure. I assume we were talking about like a serum 25 hydroxy D3 level. That would that's still the marker that I use. I know that there have been some really interesting studies in kind of a compilation of observations by different clinicians about the value of a 125 hydroxy. But I still look for a 25 OH3 or 25 hydroxy. I'd like to see that be over 45. I think, preventatively. It's not to say that 45 is always adequate. I mean, I think there are going to be conditions where levels over like 65 or 70 are going to be more conducive to the outcome that you're looking for as a clinician. Cancer in particular, because we know the role that vitamin D plays in slowing cell division. It makes sense to get levels higher, for those who are dealing with cancer. But preventatively, I like to see levels over 45. I think that's where you really start to get in that sweet spot without any questions. There are some questions that I think are being asked, and I think it's good they're being asked about levels that are too high long term in the absence of cancer. But cancer's triage. I mean, when you're dealing with something like that, I certainly as a clinician am willing to accept maybe a slightly higher risk in another area of health for at least the short term. But I think levels greater than 45 are good for most people preventatively. Now, if someone had significant bone loss, then we might want to bump that level up to 55. But when it comes to dietary intake, it's a function of where someone lives and their age, of course, their skin color or amount of pigmentation that they have. And here in New England, I usually recommend 5,000 IUs for the winter months for people who are middle-aged, let's say. But if someone were in their 70s, I think a strong argument could be made for a higher daily level. So there's a lot of different variables, but 45 is what I use for a 25 OHD3 level in terms of prevention.
Nice. Okay. Thank you. All right, here's a question for you. Does the amino acid content of animal protein have, let me see if I'm reading this right, have a problem with acid load? Or I think she's talking about the acid load of animal protein in general, or is it neutral? There's a lot of negative research regarding the consumption of meat in general. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, well,
it's a big subject.
It is. It's a huge subject. I will say a really great article came out just this morning, and I can send that to you if you don't already have it. And it really just looked at how it's been kind of misinterpreted. The research on red meat consumption. I'm not sure if you saw that this morning. It was a really good one. But anyways, it just really stepped back and took a look at the research and said, there really has not been the kind of evidence we would assume that there is to support the public health messages that we have adopted as a country, and many countries around the world have adopted about eat less meat. It's just not there, the evidence. There's marginal evidence with the processed and cured meats. But that being said, let me just I'll dive into this here with respect to the amino acid content. Many animal proteins do contain higher levels of what we call the acidic amino acids. These are amino acids that naturally have amine groups that are mild acids. They're milder acids than any amino acid, when absorbed into the bloodstream, is going to be a mild acid. Mild. I mean, it's nothing like lactic acid per se. And these mild acids, when consumed in larger quantities, are what ultimately drive that potential renal acid load that we've been talking about this afternoon. There are some amino acids, and they are typically found in animal foods, where the amino acid is a little bit more acidic. I mean, these are very, very, again, very, very minute changes to an amino acid's acidity or potential renal acid load. The big difference between plant and animal protein is not the amino acid profile per se, but it has more to do with the other components to the potential renal acid load. So the amino acids in a food contribute to the potential renal acid load. The amount of sulfur and the amount of phosphorus in any food also contribute to the potential renal acid load. So those are the three things that will increase the potential renal acid load. Protein, absolute amount of protein, which because protein is made up of amino acids. The phosphorus content, because some of that phosphorus is going to, it's going to ultimately contribute as an acid as well. Same with sulfur. Think about phosphoric acid and sulfuric acid, and these are, again, mild acids coming from food, but all of this together contributes to the potential renal acid load. Then you have those foods which are buffers against that. Those are calcium, magnesium, but the big one is potassium. Potassium is the real heavy hitter that can neutralize any acid load. Now, if we think about animal protein, think about meat, think about eggs, think about fish and chicken, think about hard cheese, which we've already talked about today. All of these things have almost, there's some potassium, but almost no potassium in comparison to plant foods. The exception, of course, is yogurt and milk. Milk is a very good source of potassium, and anything you make with milk, leaving the whey there, again, not making cheese with it, but whether it's kefir, yogurt, drinking the milk, you're going to get the potassium that is going to a large extent neutralize the protein content of that dairy product. And that's really the difference between plant and animal protein when it comes to potential renal acid load. The protein is part of the story, but an equally important part of the story is that plant foods, let's look at legumes, for instance, that's what most vegetarians are going to rely on, or vegans, I should say, would rely on beans. Well, beans have a significant amount of potassium, and they don't really have the same amount of protein that animal protein does to begin with. But what happens is the potassium content of that particular plant food neutralizes the modest amount of protein that's found in that plant food, and so you end up with something that is closer to neutral. That doesn't mean that all plant foods are neutral or alkaline. That's certainly not the case. Oatmeal has a very significant potential renal acid load. And I would argue oatmeal is more of a problem than eating eggs, because people might have 2 or 3 eggs, but they don't eat a big bowl of oatmeal. The volume really has to come into this discussion. And Tufts University now, it's been 12 years since they did the study, they showed that women who consume the most grain products were at the greatest risk for bone loss, much more so than women who ate red meat or animal protein daily. That really helped debunk this, I say help, it hasn't certainly gone to the full 9 yards, but there's still this misconception that if you eat plant foods, your bones are fine. If you eat animal proteins, are at risk. That's certainly not the case. I mean, peanut butter is a significant potential renal acid load because peanuts are unique. They're a rich source of protein, but they're not a great source of potassium like you might get with lentils or something like that. So, it's tough for people, I think, to wrap their heads around this. I don't look at animal protein as being bad for bones per se. I look at a unbalanced diet as being bad for bones. And I think if you're eating sandwiches made with bread and or some type of grain flour-based product, and then that sandwich is filled with meat or cheese or peanut butter and jelly, I think you're ending up with a significant acid load. I think if your breakfast is made up of bacon and eggs and no spinach, I think you've got an acid load. But I think you got the same problem if your breakfast is made up of a big bowl of oatmeal with, let's say, walnuts in it. That's an acid load. So, it's important for people to understand that there's 5 or 6 major components to the potential renal acid load. And every one of these should be looked at with any given food. Again, protein, phosphorus, sulfur. And then the 3 that can help make a food a little more alkaline or more balanced would be potassium. That's the big one. And then magnesium and calcium. If you understand those variables at work, then you can look at any given food. You could look at the nutrient analysis of it without looking at a PRAL table from the USDA or something like that. And you can really figure it out. The most alkaline foods are those foods which have the most potassium and the least amount of protein, i.e. dark green leafy vegetables, avocados. They're the really, but that doesn't mean you have to just, eat alkaline foods to have strong bones. The most acidic foods are those which have the most protein and the least amount of potassium. And those are going to be things like hard cheeses and lean fish. You have white fish, You have Parmesan Reggiano. These are very, very acidic foods. That doesn't mean they're bad. It just means if you have fish, you should probably have it with a dark green leafy vegetable. So I hope that helps.
Yes, it does help, John. Thank you. Some really great pearls there. Switching gears to, here's a question that came in. Are there any proven dietary recommendations to increase butyrate? And do you ever recommend supplementing with butyrate? And if you could just kind of give an overview of butyrate for those who maybe want to know more about that.
Yeah, sure. N-butyrate is that's the short chain fatty acid. It's a 4-carbon short chain fatty acid. It's the gold standard. I mean, that is the short chain fatty acid that is the best for all of human physiology. It's anti-inflammatory. It's not associated with any type of dysbiosis, which is the case with propionic acid and propionate. That's certainly not what we want to have as the predominant short chain fatty acid. But N-butyrate is. And there are some species of bacteria that are really good at producing it if they have adequate fiber and or resistant starch to work on. We know that that's not always the case, and we know that these N-butyrate levels really fall in people that either A, are missing important commensal families of bacteria, i.e. beneficial microbes, or that don't get enough of the microbially accessible carbohydrates, whether that's fiber or starch. So we know a lot of people are missing out on N-butyrate. We know that when that happens, most aspects of human physiology suffer, starting right at the gut wall. And butyrate is really needed by a lot of those epithelial cells for repair and recovery, or repair and growth. So it's important there, and then it's important all the way to the human brain and the heart. Now, if you're not getting N-butyrate produced endogenously, either because you don't carry bifidobacter or you don't eat, maybe you don't have the population yet, and you're working on that with a probiotic or eating the right types of yogurt, then I think the question is, do you supplement with N-butyrate? Do you rely on what you could get from food? I think you can get some decent levels of N-butyrate from butter. Butter is about 3 to 4% N-butyrate by weight. That's pretty good. Is that enough? I don't have an answer on that one. How much N-butyrate do we ultimately need to ameliorate the effects of being deficient in that for a while? I don't think anybody knows, at least that's, my understanding. Nobody knows at this point. I think theoretically, which is, look, that's, for better or worse, that's how a lot of functional medicine and or nutritional approaches are right now. A lot of theoretical approaches. I think taking N-butyrate in a supplemental form, here's the question: how much of that survives proximal, gastric digestion or the upper GI and gets to the lower GI? If that's where ultimately you're trying to get that N-butyrate to the lower GI, I don't know how much of it survives to that point. And if it gets absorbed in the proximal digestive tract, that may have benefits. That may offer benefits to other areas of our physiology. That may well be the case, but I think there's a lot we don't know at this point. Certainly a lot I don't know about N-butyrate metabolism when it's taken as a supplement. So I think in theory, it makes sense. I think that I'd be more in line with someone using butter because it's a great foundational food. It's a great way to kind of shift the overall macronutrient distribution in a person's diet to a better place. It's a really compatible type of fat, and it's if it's 3 to 4% N-butyrate by weight, well, that's another plus. So I'm more inclined to recommend dairy fat as a way to boost N-butyrate levels. But that being said, I don't have strong feelings against using N-butyrate supplements. I know they're becoming more popular.
Yeah, they are. All right, excellent. Thank you. Here's a question. You mentioned acellular carbohydrates in the Western diet and gut microbiota shifts. Wondering what your thoughts are regarding adding tubers into the diet and their effects on gut flora.
Yeah, great question. Tubers are always going to be less than, I think the highest tuber, even a carrot, is like 12% carbohydrate by weight. So tubers are not acellular storehouses of carbohydrate. The carbohydrates in a tuber, which for our listeners, that's a root vegetable, carrots, sweet potatoes, white potatoes, anything that grows down in the ground that's part of the root system of a plant, that's a tuber. Those carbohydrates are all part of the cell of the plant. A grain or a legume are considered, those are acellular. So those plants actually store the carbohydrate outside of the cellular matrix of the plant. No problem with eating tubers, no problem with eating starchy root vegetables. The highest carbohydrate density is like around, I think it's around 15 or 16% carbohydrate by weight. That's well below the threshold that's been established, which is 23%. If a food is more than 23% carbohydrate by weight, it's an issue. Now, look, if you took potato flour and you baked something with it, and you drove off all the water that was natural, that's a different story. So potato chip, that's different than eating obviously a potato, because you've driven off a lot of the water and now you've increased its carbohydrate density dramatically. And so I think that there's two parts of the story. Number one is you want to stay away from foods that are, again, acellular source of carbohydrates. They're all going to be much, much more than 23% carbohydrate by weight, even in a very natural state. Like you take oats, for instance, and you grind those oats up or you cook them into oatmeal. You're going to have something that's going to be about 60 to 70% carbohydrate by weight. So you're 3 times what the carbohydrate density level is. But a sweet potato that's baked or boiled, it's going to be, even a baked sweet potato, you drive off some water, it's still going to be 20%, 19% carbohydrate by weight. It's a good food to eat. So I really like starchy root vegetables, and I don't really look at them as being, they don't contribute to SIBO. They don't contribute to the overgrowth of bacteria in the distal small intestine. That's going to be acellular carbohydrates.
Okay. John, what conditions do you feel there's the greatest evidence for using a ketogenic diet?
Yeah, I think it would be most forms of cancer. And I try to be clear that I don't have empirical evidence that a ketogenic diet will cure someone of cancer long term. We just don't know that. There are certainly a large number of case studies now that are showing that, but we don't have the kind of clinical research that would allow us to make those statements. But I don't even know as though I would feel confident making those statements based on what I've observed with patients and the case studies I've looked at. So I don't look at a ketogenic diet as being a cure, but at the very least, it's going to buy people an extensive amount of time with cancer, because cancer cells are highly dependent on the glycolytic pathway and on glucose metabolism. So it just makes so much sense that you can slow cancer growth, you can stop its growth for a while. And then there are those case studies where, it works. It gives someone long-term benefits. But I think that we're at a place now with a ketogenic diet and neurological conditions where we're starting to say, hey, epilepsy, a ketogenic diet is a cure for epilepsy. I got a lot of very conventionally trained neurologists now that, don't really have they don't look at, medicine through a functional lens. They're neurologists that just want the best thing for their patients, and they put kids on a ketogenic diet. It's not probably the types of foods that we'd recommend. If we were a little more food savvy, we'd want to use, probably better quality fats. But that being said, I think we can say that a ketogenic diet is probably the best intervention for a kid or an adult with epilepsy. And I think we're starting to get to a similar place. We're not there yet, but with neurological conditions that are also neurodegenerative. Really promising results now being shown with like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, ALS, because, we know that the mitochondria are really at the core of these diseases. And we know the ketogenic diet is one of the best things for the mitochondria. So I would put, cancer, it's going to buy time. It's going to, be a big part of the most effective treatment, whether that's adjuncts to conventional treatment or, combined with other things. And I think epilepsy, I would look at a ketogenic diet as a cure for those kids, if their families are able to follow it closely. And I think we're getting to a really good place now, understanding how it can be very therapeutic for Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases.
All right, great. So with that being said, here's the next question. When do you find intermittent fasting beneficial therapeutically, and when do you think it might be contraindicated?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, we're such a monolithic society here, and we hear something, I mean, people kind of take it and they, they run with it. It's not always one size fits all. I'll say that same thing with a ketogenic diet. There are a lot of people that, again, if it's life-threatening condition, then it's triage, and I think the ketogenic diet is warranted. But for someone that just wants to do the ketogenic diet for general health or preventative reasons, and they already have a suboptimal thyroid, I don't think that it's a good fit. And that's where I'm going with intermittent fasting. I think intermittent fasting is great for people that maybe need that mitochondrial benefit, get some apoptosis going, get some autophagy going after 14 or 15 hours of fasting. And even if you only get 2 or 3 hours of upregulated autophagy, wow, we probably underappreciate the benefits of that over the course of like a year's time to the mitochondrial population in any person's cell. But I think intermittent fasting can help people that are also doing a ketogenic diet, want to really get their ketone production turned up. That being said, I think intermittent fasting can be very limiting to what people consume in a day. And I think it can undermine some very important nutrients, or the intake of nutrients. I think it's challenging for people to get enough protein unless they're diligent around their choices and how they eat in a 6 to 7 hour window of time. You're going to make sure you get the protein needed to support the muscle mass that you want to carry. You got to make sure that you consume the amount of potassium that you need for good circulatory health. And all this has to come into the big picture. Are we going to rob Peter to pay Paul? Are we going to be missing out on essential nutrients in an effort to get our ketones to a certain level? These are important questions, and I think that intermittent fasting is really therapeutic and very beneficial, and it's easy to look at its upsides given that we're in such a overfed state here as a population by and large. But it's not a good fit for everybody. I don't recommend it for kids. I don't recommend it for people that have adrenal issues, thyroid issues, or that are already deficient in a nutrient, or eat foods or a pattern of food that also makes them a little more vulnerable to deficiencies. So I think it's a good way of eating for people that are going to have dark green leafy vegetables at their 2 or 3 meals they eat during that window of eating, that they're going to get the protein they need, the magnesium they need. If we can make sure that all those nutrients are accounted for, then I'm all for it. But there are a lot of people that either don't have the time or the understanding, or they're not working with a registered dietitian or someone that can guide them in this process. So I think it's important that people look at all the details in this.
John, as you were saying that, I'll just say very quickly, as you were saying that, it was occurring to me how interesting it is that generally speaking, all the world's major religions all prescribe some type of fasting at some point for a fairly short period of time in the calendar. And so there might be some wisdom, behind not just intermittent fasting, but intermittent fasting for a period of time. In other words, not necessarily long term. I wonder, it would be interesting to take a look at the difference between fasting for a short period of time versus for a very lengthy period of time. But I think Kathy has the next question.
Yeah, and there actually was a paper, maybe I can post it, on that exact topic of looking at religious fasting and, clinical data on it. But
Yep.
here's another.
I've seen that, Kath. It looked particularly at Ramadan. Yeah, and it looked at the benefits that were observed in various populations, and there was some improvements in insulin sensitivity and glycemic control. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it was Dombrowski or someone, but anyhow, yeah, here's another, I think, really important question, since we're seeing more and more, I think, integrative and functional medicine patients with chronic infections. So the question is, are there any interventions that you have found helpful for chronic infections such as Lyme disease?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the two things that would be at the top of my list, number one would be a more optimal macronutrient selection. So we talked about a ketogenic diet, intermittent fasting, and all these different, I think these different, whether you want to call them ways of eating or philosophies, I think it's really important to support the immune system with an infection, and that's probably not going to be a ketogenic diet. That is not counter, that shouldn't be looked at as contradictory to cancer, because when you're applying a ketogenic diet or the pulse press approach to cancer, you're trying to prevent the cancer cells from having their preferred fuel. But when you're trying to support the immune system, our immune system does utilize glucose in conjunction with some other really important micronutrients. And I think that a ketogenic diet is going to be counterproductive in an infection. Now, it also depends on the nature of the infection. So eukaryotic species, eukaryotes are yeast, fungi, parasite. They can use ketones as a fuel. So it's like double whammy to eat a ketogenic diet. Yeah, you don't want to follow a ketogenic diet with a fungal infection. That's disastrous, because now what you're doing is you're robbing your immune system of the carbohydrates that it would use ideally to fight the infection, but you're providing the ketones to the fungal or parasite. So that's like the worst possible fit. But even if you're battling bacterial or a viral infection, it's important that you get about 25 to 30% of calories from carbohydrate. Obviously not fructose. Starches, what I call safe starches. So rice, the root vegetables that someone asked about earlier, those are the best choices. And then you get about 50% of calories from fat, and around 20% of calories from protein. You don't want to go over on the protein, because if your protein levels start to become too high, then that also will be leveraged against you by the infectious agent. So it's, I always go 50% fat, 30% safe starch or root vegetable. These are where your calories are coming from, and 20% protein. And then in conjunction with that, here are the two micronutrients. One of them is, something you gotta try to weave into your day, and hopefully you live in a place you can do this. But direct sunlight therapy. Direct sunlight therapy on the skin. There may not be an equal when it comes to supporting the immune system. Everybody thinks that people with tuberculosis were sent into the Southwest for the dry, arid climate. That's not it. People that were sent to the Southwest with tuberculosis, they got better because of the sunlight there. And there's really good evidence of that now. And it's independent of vitamin D. Vitamin D is part of the immune response. We have these vitamin D receptors on our white blood cells, and those vitamin D receptors have to be occupied for that white blood cell to be more vigilant and to be effective at fighting an infection. But it goes even beyond that. It goes way beyond that, because we know when infrared light penetrates the skin, it is very, very protective and effective at eliminating pathogens from all the cells that are 2 or 3 centimeters deep. The huge volume of our body. And then, of course, iodine. I think it's important for people to be maybe even more than adequate in iodine. I think this is a time to probably turn up iodine supplementation with infection. 1,000 micrograms a day. Not an unsafe amount, but certainly more than most people get. And there's some really interesting research on iodine in conjunction with vitamin C at really helping our white blood cells be more effective in defeating some of these infectious agents.
John, that's just brilliant. I think that, again, we're seeing more and more folks with these chronic infections. And just a couple other questions, since you mentioned the sunlight and such, that come to mind and that we get asked about a lot. What about light boxes? If say someone's in the Northeast and days like today, it's quite dark. And how about infrared sauna? Any quick comments on those? I know we're about to wrap it up, but
yeah,
any comments?
Sure. The light box is going to help with outlook, and I think there's some interesting papers that have been done with that, and seasonal affective disorder. And I would be an advocate for those, but you're not going to have the kind of light in a light box that's going to be therapeutic against an infection You know, you need infrared light. So that goes to the infrared sauna. Yes, I think those are beneficial. I think a vitamin D lamp can be beneficial, but you certainly don't want to read in front of one of those. They'd be very damaging to the eyes. So the eyes, you know, you want to make sure that you limit your time in front of a vitamin D lamp because they do produce burns. I look at that as, you know, being surprising to some. The pink or red skin that you get with exposure to a vitamin D lamp is, to me, it's affirmation that the UVB is actually there. But yeah, I think that whether you use a vitamin D lamp or an infrared sauna, or you live somewhere like, you know, Sheila, I think you live in Florida.
That's right.
Yeah, so you've got it year round. You can get the sunlight you need. But for those of us here in the Northeast, for instance, you know, then we got to use one of these things unless we're willing to travel.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Right. Gotcha.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, excellent. Well, and we do get a lot of rain and storms certain times of the year. So, but yeah, generally speaking, we do get it year round, and it's pretty wonderful. On that note, folks, that was a fast hour, boy. I looked up and it was an hour just kind of went by. And so I hope you all have enjoyed this amazing live Q&A session as much as Kathy and I have with Dr. John Bagnulo. John, thank you so much. I want to acknowledge that there were a lot of questions that came in that we just couldn't get to. And there were many registrants who were not able to actually get into the webinar because we maxed out pretty quickly, really within minutes. So if that's the case, be sure to post your question in the Community Cafe forum that's located in the IFNA course shell. Another place to post some of your questions to your colleagues is our free IFNA listserv, the Google Group listserv. If you want to join, if you're not aware of it and you'd like to join the free listserv, just email us at info@ifnacademy.com and we'll get you subscribed right away. Yeah, and I also want to mention, based on your fantastic feedback out there, that we know you've been wanting more live events. And so with that, we're really excited to let you know about our next live Q&A, which will be with Dr. Kara Fitzgerald, currently scheduled for Tuesday, December 10th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And of course, if anything changes, we're going to let you know. So thank you again, everyone. You're going to receive an email in a day with some information. And again, we're going to be sending out this link to everyone who registered, whether they attended or not. So no worries. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, John. Thank you, Kathy. And have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, you as well.
Take care.